Welcome to this penultimate session of our course, The Law of Philosophical Aspects, this time about the morality and law of war. Now, the starting point about war, of course, is that anywhere and everywhere, it includes unbelievable amount of suffering and pain and bloodshed and misery. And so you may think that really the only decent thing to say about war is that we just should avoid it almost at any other cost. It seems as if morality and indeed the law being decent discourses, perhaps civilized discourses, perhaps being reasoned, somehow have no way in when we're talking about the amounts of misery and bloodshed that war consists in. And so you see immediately the appeal of a pacifist view. Now, there are different pacifists, different versions of pacifism that you may come across. Some of them are entirely global and without any qualification. For instance, you may think that any resort to violence ever is unjustified morally, is indeed impermissible. That is an extremely strong kind of view. It's a very extreme one. It's even extreme compared to other versions of pacifism. More plausible, perhaps, versions of pacifism do not assert that any resort to violence is morally unjustifiable, but at least that maybe any resort to institutionalized violence, the kind of violence we see employed by states, by countries, by governments, by armies, any such resort to violence is unjustified. That too is a view that's hard to defend. It's more plausible. I think it's at the very least a respectable philosophical challenge, but it remains a view that it is hard to defend, perhaps mostly because we can think of war efforts that do seem to be morally justified. The sort of paradigmatic case is a case in which one state resorts to the use of violence as self-defense against the use of violence, indeed the unjust use of violence, by another state. So that's the paradigmatic case, the sort of state-level parallel of self-defense. But it's not at all clear that that's the only kind of case in which resort to state violence is justified. You may think that there are other cases that, if anything, exemplify more by way of virtue. So what if a state can use force in order not to defend itself or even its own citizens, but rather to defend other citizens, other civilians, other humans who are likely to be harmed by an unjust state? It's quite possible that the use of force in those cases too is justified, or anyway may be justified, given some further circumstances. You may think of cases of humanitarian interventions precisely along these lines. These are cases in which a seriously morally bad government or state engages in very harmful, often lethal activity vis-a-vis some of its own citizens. And it's quite possible that intervention is justified there too, even if it's intervention by force, at least so long as it's effective or is potentially effective. So I'm not going to be assuming pacifism here. In fact, I'm going to be assuming the denial of pacifism here, as does most of the discussion of just war theory, to which we turn shortly. Still, even if war is justified, it's very clear that not everything is justified in war. It's very clear that contrary to the common saying that all is fair in love and war, that is just not the case at all. There are things that we may call war crimes, but even without the use of this semi-legal term, it's very clear that there are things you're not allowed to do, even in the most extreme circumstances, such as war and maybe, according to some people, love as well. In the opposite direction, it's also very clear that not all is unfair in war. So there are some measures that, at least assuming pacifism is false, are justified within the context of war. And then there are others which are not. So we need moral distinctions. And if we need moral distinctions, that means that morality speaks. It's not true that when it comes to war, morality has nothing to say. And you may also think that if morality has something to say, then it wouldn't be too much to expect that the law has something to say too, as indeed it has had for ages. So this is going to be our topic here, the morality and law of war. And we start, as we often do, with morality. At least in the West, discussions of the moral status of war efforts were usually discussed under the title of what's called just war theory. Of course, as is the case very often, there are different versions of this kind of theory, and we're not going to try to do historical justice to all of them or even to one of them. I do want to mention, though, some central features, partly because they are so influential, important, perhaps intuitive, partly also because we may want to criticize them later on. Well, I will criticize them later on. So here's one absolutely central feature to the just war theory, which governs both thought of morality of war and also, to an extent, the laws of war. And that's the distinction often put in Latin between the rules that apply to when resort to war is permissible. These are sometimes called the jus ad bellum. So that's one side of the distinction. The other are the rules within war. Once you are in a war, there are rules about how to conduct yourself in that tough situation. And these rules are often called jus in bellum. That distinction is a major part of moral thought about law. There are about war. There are different questions to ask about when to resort to war and about what to do once a war is there. And it's also a major part of the international law governing wars, which we will get to later. Crucially, it's not just a conceptual distinction. The main claim in the vicinity here, or the main normative upshot of the distinction between jus ad bellum and jus in bello, is that jus in bello is to a large extent independent of jus ad bellum. The thought seems to be the following. Look, there are rules about when you can resort to war, but once you're in war, you sort of suspend the judgment about what it is that drove us to this place. And now you should just conduct yourself roughly according to the rules of the game. This is a helpful analogy, right? You may have any number of reasons to play chess or baseball or any other game. But once you're in the game, what determines what you are and are not allowed to do are the rules of the game, rather than whatever reasons you had or may not have had to start playing the game to begin with, right? So even if your reason to play chess was a very poor one, even if you shouldn't have started playing chess because there are other things more important for you to do, still once you're playing chess, the rules that apply are independent of that wider framework. They're just about the rules within the game, the jus in bello. The notion of war crimes, for instance, is usually connected precisely to violations of jus in bello, independently of jus ad bellum, independently of the reasons that led us down that path to begin with. Related to the distinction between jus ad bellum and jus in bello, an extremely important central feature of the just war theory is what is sometimes called the symmetry of combatants. So the thought here is rather simple. You have, let's assume now, two countries at war with each other. It's quite possible that one of these countries is actually conducting just war and the other unjust war. So you may think that one of them is an aggressor and the other a defender, or something along these lines. Of course, real-life cases are going to be more complicated than that, but let's assume the simple case for now. Well, in that case, the combatants on one side are fighting a just war, and on the other an unjust war. And that's really an important difference between them. But according to traditional just war theory, so long as they conduct their affair according to the rules of jus in bello, so long as they play according to the rules of the game once in the game, they have a symmetrical moral status. We do not distinguish between the moral status of the soldiers on the just side and the unjust side. That's really important. It has several implications. Here's one. It means that there is a symmetry between the combatants on both sides when it comes to what it's permissible for them to do. Say, whether it's permissible for them to use force, what kind of weapons, what proportionality requirements apply to them, and so on. So that's one thing, what they are allowed to do. Just as important now from the other direction, it means that there is a symmetry in terms of what it's permissible to do to them, in terms of their liability or vulnerability to morally permissible violence. And also, there's another symmetry here in terms of their responsibility or culpability or blameworthiness. So the thought is that combatants who participate in a war are not to be blamed for the unjustness of the war, if indeed it is unjust, so long as they conduct their affair according to the jus in bello rules. So they are to be blamed if they commit war crimes, of course, but that's it. Their responsibility, so it is often thought, is ends with the rules of the game. They are not responsible for playing the game to begin with. So in these respects, at least according to traditional just war theory, combatants are symmetrical, regardless of the justification of the war effort of which they are a part. Another central feature of the just war theory is the rather strong distinction between combatants and non-combatants. So the intuitive thought here is, who is a legitimate target? Combatants are a legitimate target. they are, as it were, fair play, but non-combatants are not. Of course, things get tricky. They often get tricky, at least in contemporary warfare, maybe not only in contemporary warfare, when it comes to what is often referred to as collateral damage. We'll return to this later on. But for now, here's the initial idea. If I am a non-combatant, I am not a legitimate target. I am not fair play. And it doesn't matter what kind of advantage you hope to achieve by killing me, you are not allowed as the opposing military to target me. That's just a distinction between the moral status of combatants and non-combatants according to traditional just war theory. However, if I live next to a munition factory, or if there is any other legitimate target that you may want to bomb or kill, in a way that may, foreseeably but unintentionally, also lead to my death, that may be permissible. Other requirements apply, perhaps most importantly a proportionality requirement, but still, so long as I am merely a collateral damage, merely foreseen rather than intended, the harm to me is merely foreseen rather than intended, then it may be permissible nonetheless. So we're going to have to think about that distinction later on. Of course, there are borderline cases between combatants and non-combatants. These are the kind of borderline cases that the tradition has been grappling with, and that we'll have maybe a little bit more to say later on. So you may think, for instance, about a soldier. This is a paradigmatic combatant. He may even be wearing uniform. But right now he's sleeping. Is he now a legitimate target? He's not really a threat right now. He's clearly a part of a threat. He's a potential threat. So we may need to know more about what it means to be a combatant according to this tradition in order to see what applies to the case of the sleeping soldier. Or you may think about other cases too. How about a civilian leader? He doesn't wear uniform. He sends others who wear uniform. He may be more morally responsible on a personal level than many soldiers, but it's not clear that the rules of certainly not the law of war, but maybe not even the morality of war. It's not clear whether they allow to target him, whether that's a legitimate target. See that in terms of contribution to the war effort, he may be offering more such contribution than many soldiers, but still, at least traditionally, he's not thought of as a combatant for the purposes of these rules, and we're going to have more to say about that. And there may be other cases. So if any contribution to the war effort counts, any taxpayer, at least on the side of the other country, is also liable. Similarly, for anyone who buys anything from any taxpayer, anyone who does any kind of business with anyone who buys anything from a taxpayer. And so if we go this far, we've gone far enough. We've, in fact, trivialized the distinction between combatants and non-combatants. So we need to say more about that distinction, both the rationale for it and the details of the way of fleshing it out. Okay, so much for an unbelievably brief introduction to the main tenets of traditional just war theory. And so we proceed rather quickly, perhaps too quickly, to some criticisms of that tradition. I should say that everything here, as you might expect, is extremely controversial. And this tradition has come under a lot of fire recently, as has its critics. Everything is controversial here. So I want to divide my discussion of challenges to the just war tradition to challenging some of the details, which is what we're going to do right now, and then proceed to challenge some of the big picture-y things about that tradition. So starting with some details. You may think that there's something outdated about just war theory. It seems like these are rules that fit more naturally the kind of war that we all, as it were, knew and loved until a few decades ago, right? So you think about battlefield, you think of pretty much organized armies. There are uniforms, there may be flags. It's very clear who is whom and who is against whom. There's a rather limited time and place, right? Often there's a declaration of war, that's the beginning. There's then a surrender or ceasefire agreement or something along, that's the end. And it's limited, it may be long, but it's still limited in time and space. And it's mostly between two organized armies. And then the rules sort of apply neatly or semi-neatly. This is just not what contemporary war looks like at all. In the kinds of wars we see today, or if you don't like using the word war for them, in the kind of institutionally violent efforts that we see today, very often you won't see two armies clearly marked with uniforms and flags fighting against each other on a limited battlefield between a declaration of war and a ceasefire agreement. What you will often see are different segments fighting against each other, often within heavily populated, or at least partly within heavily populated areas. It won't be clear who is against whom. Even when you do have an organized military on one side, you will often not have such an organization on the other side. You'll have what's often called asymmetric warfare and so on. And this is even before we started mentioning all sorts of technological developments that may change the way war, that may have already changed the way war is done. So perhaps the rules that just war theory gives us have just sort of grown out of relevance. They just don't fit anymore. Now, if we're talking about law, I think there is something very natural about this thought, right? We update our laws all the time because we know that laws should fit the relevant social circumstances. And as social circumstances change, laws may have to be changed too. So we engage in engineering legal changes all the time, partly in order to try and compensate for the law already being late on the scene, compared to all sorts of changes in the social relevant circumstances. So when it comes to law, this is a very natural thought. When it comes to morality, it's bordering on paradoxical. We don't engage in moral engineering. The moral laws are not up to us in anything like the way the law is. And so you may think that it just doesn't make sense, the thought that the moral laws have changed merely because the nature of war has. But I don't think we should get into these more abstract discussion of the nature and status of moral laws, like discussions in what's called metaethics. I don't think we need to get into discussions in metaethics here. The thought is more simple than that. The thought is that the rules that were always in place, the moral principles that always applied, still apply, except they apply in a way that's sensitive to circumstances. So in some circumstances, they call for one kind of response, and in other sets of circumstances, they call for other kinds of response. It's just that when circumstances change, the same universal, necessary, eternal principles call for now a different response. So one way of understanding what's been going on is that we've just been overgeneralizing our conclusions. The conclusions from the moral principles that we drew with regard to war were actually not applicable to war in general. They were really with regard to war in the 19th century, or war between two organized militaries. And now we need to rethink what follows from the very same internal moral principles to more specific cases of the kind that we see today. So even though it's not clear what to do with the general criticism that says, look, your rules, they're outdated, reality has once again stepped more quickly into the future than you have, which may be true. It's still not clear what to do with it, right? We still have to decide. Perhaps what we can do is roughly the best we can, namely, maybe we should return to the underlying moral principles and now plug in newer, better informed versions of the factual claims and see what follows from those principles to the circumstances at hand. And this is pretty much what we're going to be doing. Remember, we're now still in the stage of criticizing just war theory, but now offering sort of local criticisms of the details, or pretty much of the details. So here's one such line. What's so special about combatants? I've already hinted at this. Why is the distinction between combatants and non-combatants the relevant distinction? Remember the intuitive thought there is that not everyone's a legitimate target, right? The soldier who is about to shoot at you, he or she, more commonly, he is a legitimate target. His daughter is not, right? That's the intuitive distinction. We need some such distinction. That seems plausible enough. But why think that the best way of fleshing out the distinction is in terms of the distinction between combatants and non-combatants? So it's really not clear. It's not clear why exactly it is that we need this distinction, and if so, how to best justify it. So one way of thinking about it is in terms of contribution to the war effort, right? So you may think that what makes the soldiers who are about to shoot you a legitimate target is that he is now contributing to the war effort of the enemy country, but his daughter does not. So that's a good distinction. At least what seems plausible about it is that if that distinction holds, then we have we see why it's a difference that makes a difference. The difference between someone who does and who does not contribute to the enemy's war effort seems to be the kind of distinction that calls for differential moral treatment. So that's good. But it doesn't get you the distinction between combatants and non-combatants. First of all, it's just not true that all soldiers actually contribute to the war effort. That's not what military service looks like for many people. And perhaps even more clear, it's very clear that many who are not combatants do contribute to the war effort. I've already mentioned the sort of combative civilian leader, and maybe those who fund the war, and maybe diplomats abroad who engage in mobilizing international support for it, and so on. So that won't get you the kind of distinction you want. You may sort of resort to potential contribution, right? Think about the sleeping soldier again. He's not now contributing to the war effort, but you may think of him as potentially contributing to the war effort because he may get up. But of course, if we're going for potential contribution, then the criterion we end up with is far too wide because the soldier's daughter, who is now maybe 4 and entirely innocent and does not contribute to the war effort, but she, of course, has the potential to contribute to the war effort if the war or related conflicts continue for long enough. So that does not seem to be a good criterion either, at least unless you come up with a kind of distinction between different kinds of potential contributions, long-term, short-term, or some other along these lines. And when you do come up with such a criterion, you had better make sure that it still maintains normative plausibility, so that the distinction between the potential that counts and the potential that does not count of contribution to the war effort is a difference that seems to make a moral difference. I'm not sure this can be done. You may think that the real question is not about contribution, but about threat. The soldier who is about to shoot you constitutes a real threat to your life. Maybe that's what makes him a legitimate target. But of course, the vast majority of combatants do not right now or at any specific moment pose a threat to you or even to anyone else on your side. So that's not good enough. And if we're talking about a potential threat, we're again stuck with a criterion that's way too wide. It applies to way too many cases. It may render the category of the non-combatants trivial. The distinction trivial. It may render that category empty, vacuous. Also, it's not clear that that is a difference that makes a normative difference. Why should potential threats be treated differently from those who are not potential threats? I see why a threat should be, an actual threat should be treated differently. But once we retreat to potential threats, I'm not sure that distinction still makes a moral difference. So I don't have a general conclusion here, but I think it's safe to say that the just war theory or anything in the vicinity, or indeed anyone else who wants to maintain something like the distinction between legitimate and illegitimate targets, owes us an account of that in virtue of which some are and some aren't a legitimate target. It's not clear that it will be helpful to talk in terms of combatants and non-combatants, but we need some distinction here, and that's not going to be an easy challenge to deal with. And here's another kind of detail. So it's a huge part of just war theory that we distinguish between targets and collateral damage. So here's the kind of example. I already mentioned a version of it. It's sometimes put in the literature in terms of strategic bombing versus terrorist bombing. So let's make things dramatic. Suppose that you are actually fighting on the good side. You are fighting a just war. And what's going to be really effective in order to win that war is to bomb a kindergarten where 15 children will die. It'll be really effective perhaps because it will demoralize the enemy or something along these lines. Just war theory is very clear on this. You ought not to do that, and that's it. Not even if it means losing the war, pretty much. That's it. Impermissible. The kindergarten and the kids within it are not a legitimate target. So that's the case of strategic bombing. That's the case of terrorist bombing, right? Harming individuals who are entirely illegitimate as targets, right? People who are not liable to be killed in war, like the children in my kindergarten example. You are targeting them in order to gain an effect, perhaps a publicity effect, perhaps some other kind of demoralizing effect, and so on. So terrorist bombing is, of course, impermissible, according to just war theory. But if you're considering bombing a legitimate target, say military headquarters, a munition factory, something along these lines, sometimes you may do it even knowing full well that the kindergarten next to it and the 15 children in it will perish as well. They are not your target. You don't intend their killing, but you foresee that they will all die. And this is an important distinction. Terrorist bombing, never justified. Strategic bombing may be justified, depending on other details, perhaps most importantly, that the harm, including to the collateral damage, is proportional to the justifiable mission you are engaging in. Now that distinction, I think, clearly, as the example show, clearly corresponds to a deep intuition. And so we can't, even if you want to criticize it at the end of the day, it's going to be a long day. There's a lot of stuff you have to do in order to criticize that distinction. So the question is whether upon reflection, that distinction or distinctions in their vicinity survive critical attention. I'm not sure that this is so. One way of at least making some progress on the discussion here is to think about more general issues in moral philosophy, a more general distinction of which this is a particular instance, and see whether there's anything else we can say with that in mind. Before doing that, let me offer a cautionary note, and this is one that's going to be relevant on a couple of other slides too, as you will see. Although it's very natural to think of moral questions vis-a-vis war in terms of more private, small-scale interactions between individuals, it's not obvious that that's a legitimate move. There's always going to be the question whether the maybe self-defense issues or other issues between individuals scale up, as it were, to the case of war. So we're going to return to this. For now, I just want to caution you against accepting such analogies without reflection. It's always a further step, and it's always one that you can question. For now, though, let's think about individual cases. So here are a couple of cases that you may have already heard of. If you've not, you can Google them and find all sorts of versions, including some parodies, including some rather funny ones. But anyway, here they are. They're quite sketchy, as many examples in moral philosophy often are. So here's the trolley case. In the trolley case, you have 5 people who are somehow sitting on a rail track for some reason. And there's a trolley that's about to hit them and kill them all. And they can't run away, so no cheating, please. But you can, it's within your power to divert the trolley. Maybe you can press a button or something, and you will divert the trolley from that track so that the 5 are saved. However, if you divert the trolley, it will then proceed on a side track, and there is one person there too. So if you divert the trolley, one person will die. And as we often say in moral philosophy, assume that all other things are equal. So it's not as if the 5 are really nice people and the one is not, or the one's mother really loves him but the 5 are lonely, or the 5 will cure cancer and the one will not. None of these things apply, right? So if one is cute, so is everyone else. And so here's the question, right? You can do nothing, the 5 will die, the one will not. Or you can divert the trolley. The 5 will survive, the one will be hit by the trolley and die. And so the intuitive question is whether it's at least morally permissible for you to divert the trolley. Okay, that's an interesting question. I guess opinions may differ, but typically they do not, or anyway, not that much. Most people immediately accept that it's morally permissible to divert the trolley. Maybe it's even morally required, or anyway desirable, but even if it's not required or desirable, it's at least morally permissible. So that's one case, the trolley case. Here's a different version of the case. Once again, 5 people, once again a trolley, once again they can't run away. Now there is no sidetrack and no button, but you are standing on a bridge and next to you there is another person. If you push that other person off the bridge, he will fall on the tracks. He will stop the trolley and the 5 will be saved. But he will die because that's how he stops the trolley, with his own weight. And now when you ask people, well, is it morally permissible to throw that one person off the bridge? Not whether it's required, not even whether it's desirable, whether it's even morally desirable to throw the person off the bridge. Almost all of them immediately say no. It's a paradigmatic case of even murder. Now, maybe there's something good about your motivations. You're doing it in order to save the 5. That's nice. But you're murdering an innocent person. And from my experience of really undisciplined experiments, so then judging just by asking people in classes, it seems like even some people who are not sure about the cases, when you put to them the question comparatively, so when you ask, well, is it at least more morally problematic to throw the person off the bridge than it is to divert the trolley in the first case, they all agree that it's at the very least more morally problematic. So it seems like in this case what's going on is that we are committed to, rather strongly committed, to a moral distinction. But it's not clear what the difference is. What's the difference between the two cases? I was really careful in the way I put the cases to make sure that there is, for instance, no difference in consequences. The numbers are the same. One innocent person will pay if you choose to save the 5 anyway, and you can show other similarities as well. So what's the difference? And here's a natural reply. And once again, let me remind you that everything is controversial. So when I say that it's a natural reply, I don't thereby say that it's necessarily true. The natural reply is that we are in the territory of what's sometimes called the intending foreseeing distinction. So in the case of the throwing the man off the bridge, you intend that person's death. Of course, that's not your goal. Your goal is to save the 5. We know that. You get credit for that. But still, the death of the one you are throwing off the bridge is a means to that end. And so you intend it as not as an end, but as a means to your end. That's not the case in the first trolley case that we mentioned. In that case, you of course fully foresee the death of the one. It's a foreseeable side effect. But you don't intend the death of the one. The death of the one is not, of course it's not your end, but it's not even a means. The means is diverting the trolley. That one will die is a foreseeable side effect and not a means. And you may think that the distinction between intending something either as an end or as a means to an end, and intending a harm to another either as an end or a means to an end, versus merely foreseeing it, that distinction is crucially important. You may think, for instance, that it takes much more to justify intending harm to someone than foreseeing harm to someone. The kind of moral weight that has to be on the other scale has to be much more significant if we're going to intend harm. And perhaps sometimes there is no consideration sufficiently moral weight to justify intending that kind of harm. So that distinction, the distinction between intending and foreseeing, is a distinction that's very central to our moral thinking, independently of the war, of the discussions of war. And it comes up in many other cases as well. Let me give just maybe 1 or 2 more quick examples. So the traditional Catholic doctrine response to the question whether it's ever okay to give someone lethal doses of morphine when they're in great suffering and there's nothing else we can do for them except for alleviate their pain. So it's not supposed to be allowed to, the Catholic Church is not a fan of euthanasia or indeed of suicide. But they have a kind of a compromised position going on here. Here's roughly what it is. It's never justified to intend to kill someone, not even as a means to alleviating their own pain and suffering. Okay, so that's where the doctrine is very clear and hard. But if you are increasing dosages of morphine with the intention of reducing pain, even if you foresee that death may also follow, that's okay. Because in that case, the death was a matter of a foreseen side effect. The end and the means to it were not the death. They were something about alleviation of pain and suffering, which the Catholic Church is, of course, entirely for in these cases. So you see that it's the same kind of distinction doing work. Now, you may want to criticize either the distinction in general or this application of it, but I want to just emphasize how central it is to much of our moral thinking. And as you can see, of course, it's exactly that distinction that applies to the war case. The distinction between strategic and terrorist bombing is precisely that distinction. In strategic bombing, when you're bombing a legitimate target, foreseeing the death of the children in the kindergarten, the death to them is merely a foreseen side effect. It's not a means to your end. But in terrorist bombing, that's not the case. In terrorist bombing, the death of the children, which you may still, in some way, you may still regret, you don't think it's a good idea in itself. That's not your end. Your end is, of course, to win the just war. But still, it's a means to your end. And so you're intending it as a means. And so it's not justified in the way it could have been had it been merely collateral damage. That is, had it been merely foreseen side effect. So it's the same distinction, I think. And so pretty much the question whether any kind of a distinction along these lines can work in the war context, and so whether this part of just war theory can be vindicated, may depend on the more general questions about the intending foreseeing distinction. And here, everything, but everything is controversial. You may need more cases. You may need more cases because you may want to offer sharper distinctions. Maybe you need a better understanding of how exactly to distinguish between intending and foreseeing so that you end up with a morally plausible distinction. So again, if you Google the trolley cases, what you'll find are any number of variations on them trying to be sharper about the morally relevant distinction. And there are some discussions, including some that I was a part of, that seem to challenge that whole distinction, the whole intending foreseeing distinction and its moral significance. Some people think that we don't even have the needed conceptual apparatus for that distinction. Or some people think that, yeah, sure, we can distinguish conceptually between intending and foreseeing harm to others, but once we do distinguish between them in a conceptually respectable way, we'll see that that distinction is of no moral significance. The different arguments can come up here. Let me just note one. When high-ranking military officials rely on that distinction, having bombed the munition plant and foreseeably killed the 15 children, often it sounds as if what they're engaging is evading responsibility rather than engaging in bona fide moral deliberation. Now that may just be a sort of superficial point about maybe abuse of that discourse, but it may run deeper than that. You may think that there's a problem with either the distinction in general between intending and foreseeing or with its application to war cases. Anyway, it seems that if the distinction between intending and foreseeing is morally significant elsewhere, that gives us at least some reason to believe, because things may not scale up, but at least some reason to believe that it has significance in the war case as well. If at the end of the day we need to reject the distinction elsewhere, that gives some reason to believe that it can't be of much use here otherwise. And let me again remind you, that was just about morality. So it's true that the laws of war are right behind the corner, but it's an important corner. We're not just there. We're not there just yet. We'll get there. Okay, so much for the more detailed kind of small scale, well, they're not really small scale, but smaller than what's coming, small scale criticisms of just war theory. I want to offer some more general themes here. And some of them are, I guess, motivated by a kind of a cynical view of that tradition. And here's a way or a couple of ways of viewing that. So you may think that the rules, as we come to know them in just war theory, they are much too heavily influenced by what may be thought as a kind of a machismo honor thing, right? So think about how gentlemen duel each other, if need be to the death, but still. Right? The kind of battle going on there. That's the one in which, of course, if someone is not a combatant or is even unarmed, perhaps, then they're not illegitimate. That's not how gentlemen kill each other. Right? So you may think that the rules of war are somehow motivated by such things, by considerations of manly honor and pride, which are perhaps easy to understand, for some of us, I guess, easier than for others. But regardless of how easy it is to understand them, they are really not at all easy to justify. So we've come to see them as kind of, this kind of thought as kind of undermining the traditional rules rather than supporting them. They're not just easy to undermine, they're also really easy to make fun of. So here's one line that I like from The Princess Bride. You mean you'll put down your rock and I'll put down my sword and we'll try to kill each other like civilized people? That's Wesley, also known as the Man in Black in The Princess Bride. So you see how you may be cynical of the whole rules of war kind of thing. The civilized thing is not to kill each other in a civilized way. Similarly, the distinction between the combatants and non-combatants, one way of understanding it is a way of defending all the innocent children out there or protecting them from the horrible details of war. But there are other ways of viewing that distinction too. So you may think, for instance, that it's really a way of defending those in power who are non-combatants typically, right? Or the rich who are typically, but not necessarily, not combatants, defending them and their loved ones from the horrible fate of war that they don't have as much problem subjecting others to. So here's a quote from Shrek, from one of these not really morally admirable leaders, saying, "Some of you may die, but that is a sacrifice I am willing to make." So these are, I think, rather plausible genealogical hypotheses. That is, hypotheses about how we got here. Plausible historical stories of how it is that we ended up with the doctrine as we know it, both in law, but right now in morality. But even if it's true, even if that's how we got here, that still doesn't say that these are bad rules or that they should be reformed in some way or that they no longer apply. So here, as everywhere else, we should distinguish between more historical considerations and more substantive ones. What we really need are arguments. We need arguments if we want to criticize just war theory. What we need are arguments against its main tenets and not just cynical views, perhaps to an extent undermining historical stories of how we got here. So let's try with some arguments here. And now I want to use such arguments in order to criticize the extremely central feature, perhaps the central feature of just war theory, namely the distinction between jus ad bellum and jus in bello, and in particular the independence of the latter from the former. So assume that we have a war between two countries. One country is engaging in just self-defense, and we will call it defender. And the country that it defends itself against, we will call aggressor. And we're assuming that that aggression is not justified. So of course, once again, real-life cases are going to be complicated. They're going to be, I think in most cases of war, what you're going to see is at least some unjust stuff going on both sides, and then it may be a matter of degree. There may be really important evidential questions. So it may be just most parties will not be able to know who is at fault and why. There may be other evidential issues. There may be even some cases in which a war occurs without any party being blamed with it. Perhaps innocent mistakes on both sides, together with problems in trust, communication, and other issues can lead to a war of this kind. But let's focus on the typical, well, I don't know if it's typical, on the paradigmatic case of war, in which we have an unjust aggressor and a just defender defending itself. Okay, what can we say about the armed forces of defender and of the armed forces of aggressor? Well, the armed forces of defender are fighting for justice. They're fighting for a just cause. And the armed forces of aggressor are fighting against it. Suppose for now that they don't commit war crimes. They don't violate the rules in the game. They don't violate jus in bello. But still, those of the defender state fight for justice, and those of the aggressor state fight against it. Shouldn't they make a difference to what it's permissible for them to do, or perhaps to what it's permissible to do to them, or perhaps to how culpable or blameworthy they are? I mean, think about it in this way. You're a soldier of defender. You are literally doing nothing wrong. You may be entirely admirable. You are fighting justly for a just cause. How can that make it permissible for other people to kill you? When you think about it in this way, it just seems almost inconceivable, the thought that there's a symmetry of combatants and that jus in bello is independent of jus ad bellum. Or in the opposite direction, suppose you're a soldier for aggressor, and assume for now that you know that your country is the unjust party in this conflict. Well, if you're engaged in a part of this collective aggressor unjust effort, how does this make it permissible for you to kill people? And furthermore, to kill the defender soldier from the previous example? So the independence of the jus in bello compared to vis-a-vis jus ad bellum is at this point threatened. And with it, crucially, the symmetry of combatants is threatened as well. This is the main point of criticism, of contemporary criticism of the just war theory, made perhaps most famous by Jeff McMahon, but it's a point pursued by others as well. Well, on this view then, if we cannot defend this distinction between jus in bello and jus ad bellum, or anyway, the independence of jus in bello from jus ad bellum, in this case, what should soldiers do? The answer is that it depends. It depends on who are they fighting for. If their country's in the right, then they should fight. Of course, some jus in bello rules still apply, so they're not allowed to maybe commit torture or other war crimes. But, of course, it's permissible for them to fight because they're fighting with justice. They are defending justifiably their state rather than engaging in illegal aggression. But if their country is in the wrong, then they shouldn't fight at all. That's what they should do, even not within jus in bello. So it's not just about war crimes. They shouldn't kill these other people even as civilized people. They just shouldn't kill at all because their killing would amount to killing in the service of an unjust cause. Of course, real-life cases are going to be complicated in some of the versions, in some of the ways that I already described. You may think, for instance, that very often soldiers, even of the unjust party, are not in a position to know that they are. Or maybe are at least sort of forgiven for thinking that they are in the just. It's really hard to believe of yourself, of your loved ones, of everyone around you, that they're engaged in a terrible war effort and killing innocent people. So we may at least excuse it, even if not justify it. We may find it really forgivable, something along these lines. So there are going to be complicated cases, and so maybe even if we accept Jeff McMahon's kinds of criticisms, we shouldn't proceed to immediately criticize or blame all soldiers of the unjust aggressor. But still, there are going to be many cases in which they do know, or anyway they ought to know, and then they shouldn't fight. And even if they do know, even if they don't know, and they may be partly excused, still there is no symmetry between combatants on both sides, one just, one unjust. So now I sort of submit to you the following question. On reflection, is this a problem? Or, the thought that whether it's permissible to kill you, whether it's permissible for you to kill, may depend on whether or not you're a part of a just cause. Does that sound like a bug or a feature? Right? And it seems to me that on reflection, there's something deeply counterintuitive about the just war theory traditional claim that these considerations are just irrelevant. Perhaps there's something that can be said, and perhaps there's something that can be said about the law here, to which we will turn a little later. But the thought that at the basic level of morality, the symmetry of combatants holds, is at the very least strongly counterintuitive. So if you want to still maintain it, you owe us some serious argumentative temptation. Otherwise, at least I am with McMahon. Okay, related but still somewhat different discussion. And I think this highlights a kind of a conflict, a kind of a tension within this literature as a whole. So critics of just war theory often get support from comparing the cases relevant to war to cases of individual violence, in particular individual self-defense. So for instance, in cases of individual self-defense, there is nothing at all analogous to the jus ad bellum, jus in bello distinction. If there's a conflict between an illegitimate individual aggressor, so I've played with the names, now aggressor and defender are individuals rather than states. If unjust aggressor and just defender are in a conflict, there is no sense in which there is a moral symmetry between their status. There are things that the one's allowed to do that the one's not. There are things that it's permissible to do to the aggressor that it's not allowed to do to the defender, and so on. No one is even tempted by the thought that there's a symmetry in those cases. So to the extent that you are on board with regard to the individual self-defense cases, why should we go for any kind of symmetry claim when we're moving to the state level? Why should the scale or the context of war make such an important moral difference? Again, notice that we're not yet asking about the law or even about other sort of semi-legal institutional arrangements. We'll get to them later. Right now, we're just asking about morality. The distinction is important. Even if on moral terms there is no symmetry between, say, the combatants on both sides, you may think that there are still some reasons to make it the case that they're legally on a par, right? So we're just focusing on the moral case for now. And the question about whether it's okay to use such examples from individual self-defense is really a particular instance of a more general question. The more general question is whether the morality of war is just a scaled-up extension of the moral rules of self-defense, of individual self-defense and maybe other defense, or whether it's just a different phenomenon in a more basic kind of way. I think that there's something appealing about the thought that scale just doesn't matter. There's self-defense. What if there are two people engaged in self-defense in the face of maybe three aggressors? Still, we're still in the territory of individual self-defense moral rules. And if it's not 2 or 3, but 2,000 or 3,000, seems to be the same. I mean, of course, you need to be sensitive to the facts, and some instrumental considerations are going to be somewhat different. But to a large extent, it's just the same thing scaled up. There's at least this kind of intuition. But things are really complicated. I just want to highlight a few complications. You may think that when we're thinking now about the relationship between the states, aggressor and defender, compared to the two individuals, aggressor and defender, then the same considerations scale up. So just like as there is no symmetry between the aggressor and the person engaging in individual self-defense, similarly, there is no symmetry, no moral symmetry between the aggressor state and the defender state. So on the state level, what's going on between states is, according to this view, precisely analogous to what's going on between individuals in the individual case. But that's not the end of the story, because when we're discussing war, there are more agents than just the states. It's not just state A versus state B. There are also soldiers. There are also military units. And in the individual case of self-defense, there is no parallel to that, right? Recall that the claim about the symmetry of the moral status of combatants, that's not about the symmetry of moral status of states. No one believes that. The claim is that there is something special. Somehow the unjustness of the state does not infiltrate the moral status of all or most of its soldiers or its combatants. So there is no analog in the self-defense, in the individual self-defense case, to that thought, to the thought that maybe even if the states are not morally symmetrical, their combatants are. Furthermore, the relations between states and its soldiers seem to be morally significant. Perhaps, for instance, soldiers owe obedience to their state, at least within some constraints, perhaps even when the state is engaged in an unjust war, although that's controversial too, of course. I think in the background here is an even deeper tension, and that's the question whether, at the end of the day, war, or the morality of war, is irreducibly collectivist, or has at least some parts of it that are irreducibly collectivist. I mean, to begin with, wars are typically between countries or nations, or in perhaps even worse cases, between religions, sometimes between tribes, something along these lines. You may think, for instance, that being an Israeli, assuming that Israel engages in some unjust war efforts or occupation or something along these lines, being an Israeli already makes me more morally liable. Just in virtue of my being an Israeli, regardless of whether I'm a combatant, regardless of whether I am even supporting such efforts, right? You may think that even if I have done personally no wrong, I've even gone to a demonstration or two or written an op-ed against the war, so I object to the war effort, still, you may think that being an Israeli makes me more liable to some more morally, permissibly liable to some ways of opposing Israel, again, assuming that Israel is engaged in at least some unjust, violent policies. Once again, if there is such a collectivist feature of war, and it seems like there is, then it does not have an immediate parallel in the case of individual self-defense. The interesting discussion, I think, or the major tension underlying many other controversies in the discussion of the morality and law of war, is not whether war has a collectivist aspect. I don't think that anyone denies that. But whether that collectivist aspect is basic, fundamental, or whether at the end of the day we can somehow reduce that collectivist aspect to more individualist ones that we know and love from discussions of personal individual self-defense. But in order to see whether this can be done, we need more examples.